I found my mother 3 hours before the county declared her legally incapable of making her own decisions. By then, her room at the care facility had already been emptied, her personal records had been restricted, and a respected man in our community was telling everyone she was confused. But when Julian Voss finally found her, she was not wandering, lost, or frightened. She was kneeling inside a limestone cave, tending rows of green plants growing beneath a mountain. And the first thing she said was not "help me." It was, "Don't let Reverend Rook know I'm here." In that moment, Julian realized his mother had never disappeared at all. Someone had hidden her. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 days earlier, Julian still believed money had kept his mother safe. The ballroom in Charleston was filled with investors, reporters, and executives from across the state. Screens displayed charts about sustainable food production. Cameras flashed. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of coffee and sparkling water. Julian Voss stood near the stage adjusting the cuff of his jacket as he glanced toward the entrance for the 5th time in 10 minutes. His mother was late. That alone wasn't unusual. Julian Voss had never cared much about schedules, but this event mattered to her. When Julian had announced a major investment program supporting small agricultural communities across West Virginia, she had insisted on attending. "You spend so much time helping strangers grow food," she had teased him during their last call. "Maybe I'll finally see what all the fuss is about." He smiled at the memory. Then he checked his watch again. Still nothing. His assistant approached quietly. "Mr. Voss," the facility called. Julian turned. "What happened?" "They said your mother isn't feeling well today." Something about the answer irritated him immediately. "What kind of unwell?" The assistant hesitated. "They didn't really say." Julian frowned. The event began. He delivered his speech. People applauded. Investors shook his hand. But through all of it, a small knot of unease sat in the back of his mind. By late afternoon, he called the care facility himself. The administrator answered on the second ring. "Lillian is resting," she said warmly. "Can I speak to her?" A pause. "Today may not be the best day." "Why, she's had some confusion." Julian straightened. "What kind of confusion?" "Nothing serious. We simply don't want to upset her." The explanation felt rehearsed, too smooth, too practiced. For the first time in years, Julian felt something he hadn't expected: suspicion. After ending the call, he contacted his mother's physician directly. The doctor returned his call that evening, and what he said made Julian sit upright in his chair. "I haven't placed any visitation restrictions on your mother." Julian blinked. "What? I haven't recommended isolation either." The doctor sounded confused. "Her blood pressure fluctuates occasionally, but as far as I know, she's perfectly capable of deciding who she wants to see." Julian thanked him and ended the call. Then he sat motionless for nearly a minute. Someone was lying. The next morning he drove directly to the facility. The administrator seemed startled to see him. "Mr. Voss, if you had called, where's my mother?" The woman swallowed. "She's resting. I'd like to see her." Another hesitation. This one lasted longer. Julian didn't wait for permission. He walked past her and headed down the hallway. When he reached Lillian's room, he stopped. The bed was made. The closet was empty. The framed photographs that normally sat beside the window were gone. Several cardboard boxes were stacked near the wall. The room looked less like someone lived there, and more like someone had moved out. A cold feeling settled in his chest. "What is this?" The administrator appeared behind him. "We were reorganizing." Julian turned slowly. "Where is my mother?" For the first time, the woman looked genuinely nervous. "I don't know." The answer hung in the air. Julian stared at her. Then he walked out before he said something he would regret. As he crossed the parking lot, a voice called softly behind him. "Mr. Voss." He turned. A woman in a kitchen uniform stood near the service entrance. She looked around nervously before approaching. "I wasn't supposed to do this." Julian frowned. The woman slipped a folded piece of paper into his hand. "Your mother gave me that 2 days ago." His pulse quickened. "What is it?" "She told me if anything happened, I should give it to you." Before he could ask another question, the woman hurried back inside. Julian unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "Blind hollow, limestone door, don't trust Rook." For several seconds he simply stared. Reverend Elias Rook was one of the most respected men in the county. He chaired charity drives, raised money for struggling families, sat on community development committees. His mother had spoken highly of him for years, yet there it was. Don't trust Rook. By sunset, Julian was driving into the mountains. The roads narrowed, the cell signal disappeared, the forests grew thicker. Blind Hollow wasn't on most maps anymore. It was one of those forgotten Appalachian places people passed through without noticing. Night had almost fallen when he spotted it, a weathered path leading toward a limestone hillside. And there, partially hidden behind vines and stone, stood a heavy wooden door built directly into the mountain, the limestone door. Julian stepped from his truck. The air felt colder here. Still, silent. Then he noticed something else, a faint glow beneath the doorframe, light coming from inside the mountain. His heart began to pound. Slowly he reached for the handle, and from somewhere beyond the door, deep inside the darkness, he heard his mother's voice speaking to someone he could not see. Julian stood in front of the limestone door with one hand on the iron handle and the other closed around his mother's note. For a moment he did not move. The voice inside was hers, older, thinner but unmistakably Julian Voss. He had heard that voice over hundreds of carefully arranged phone calls, always softened by distance, always interrupted too soon by a nurse or an administrator saying she needed rest. But this voice was different. It was low and steady, not confused, not wandering, not lost. She was talking to someone. Julian leaned closer. "I told you," Lillian said from inside the mountain. "He will come if he sees the note." A second voice answered, but it was too faint for Julian to understand. It sounded female, rough with age or cold or both. His chest tightened. He pulled the handle. The door groaned open. Cold air rolled out first, damp and mineral heavy, carrying the smell of wet stone, old soil, and something impossibly green. Julian stepped inside and stopped so suddenly his shoulder struck the doorframe. The cave was not empty. A narrow lantern sat on a flat rock, casting gold light across the first chamber. Beyond it, rows of stone beds stretched into the darkness. In those beds, pale lettuce, herbs, and other fragile green plants rose from dark soil. Water moved through shallow channels cut into the limestone floor. It whispered through the cave like a secret being repeated again and again. And there, kneeling beside one of the beds, was his mother. Julian Voss wore a soaked wool coat over the thin cardigan he recognized from their last video call. Her white hair had come loose from its pins. Dirt marked one cheek. Her hands were bare, red, and bleeding at the knuckles as she packed soil around the base of a damaged plant. An older woman stood near the back wall, wrapped in a faded canvas jacket. Julian did not know her, but she held a pry bar in one hand like she had been ready to defend the place if the wrong person walked in. "Mom," Julian said. Lillian turned. For one heartbeat her face opened with such relief that Julian almost broke where he stood. Then the relief vanished, replaced by fear so sharp it seemed to pull the light out of her eyes. "Close the door," she whispered. Julian stepped forward. "You're hurt. Close it first." The command in her voice stopped him. Not because it was loud, because it was his mother, the woman they had described as confused, fragile, easily upset. Yet here she was, giving orders in the dark with more clarity than anyone he had spoken to in the last 24 hours. He closed the limestone door behind him. The older woman lowered the pry bar but did not put it down. "Who is she?" Julian asked. "A friend," Lillian said, "and more sense than both of us right now." The woman gave him a hard look. "Name's Nora Pike. Your mother sent for me before she went into that place, but by the time I got her message, they had already moved her." Julian looked back at Lillian. "The facility said you were resting. Then they said they didn't know where you were. Your room was packed." Lillian's face tightened at the word room. "They were not packing for my comfort," she said. Julian crouched beside her, reaching for her hands. She let him take them, but only for a second. The skin was cold. The cuts were shallow, but there were too many of them. "What happened?" he asked. "Why are you here?" Lillian looked past him, toward the door as if the mountain itself might be listening. "Because this is the only place he could not sign away while I was still able to stand inside it." Julian felt the sentence settle in him with a weight he did not yet understand. "Rook?" Her fingers tightened around his. "Do not say his name loudly in here." "Mom, he can't hear us through stone. You don't know what he hears." It was the kind of thing that might have sounded paranoid if Julian had not spent the last day being lied to by professionals in clean offices. He pulled out his phone. No signal, of course. He still thumbed the emergency screen from instinct. Lillian saw it and grabbed his wrist. No police. Not yet. You're injured. They moved your belongings. They restricted access to you without your doctor's approval. I'm calling someone. No. Her voice cracked, but not from weakness. From terror. If you call before you understand the papers, they will take me back before sunrise. Julian stared at her. What papers? Lillian looked at Nora, then back at him. Shame moved across her face, quiet and old. A care consent form. Temporary, they said, just until my pressure stabilized. Reverend Rook brought it himself. He said it would make things easier for you because you were busy. Julian felt heat arise in his chest. I never asked him to do that. I know that now. Why didn't you tell me? Pain flickered in her eyes. Not fear this time, something worse, because every time I tried, someone was standing beside the phone. The cave seemed to grow smaller around him. Julian remembered the calls, the cheerful administrator, the background voice reminding Lillian that she had only a few minutes, his mother's careful pauses, the way she had sometimes started a sentence and then stopped, saying she had forgotten what she meant. He had believed the explanation handed to him. Aging, fatigue, confusion. He had believed it because believing it was easier than driving 2 hours and sitting in front of her until she told him the truth. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt too small to carry what he meant. Lillian pulled her hands away gently. Be sorry later. We need to leave before Nora's truck is noticed. Nora stepped closer. There's an old cabin above the cave. Not much, but it's better than dragging her back to that facility. Julian looked around the chamber again, the water channels, the stone beds, the plants growing where no plants should have survived. What is this place? Lillian's expression changed. For the first time since he had opened the door, something like pride came through the fear. It was Marin's, she said. The name meant almost nothing to him. A dead relative, a story no one finished, a woman his family had mentioned with lowered voices and quick subject changes. Marin Voss? Lillian nodded. She built this? She started it. I kept it alive. Julian looked at her, stunned. You? Not well enough, she said, glancing at the damaged bed. Not lately. Before Julia could ask more, a sound echoed from outside, a car door, then another. Nora killed the lantern with one sharp twist. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Julian held his breath. Through the thick limestone door, faint but clear, came the crunch of footsteps on frozen leaves. More than one person, slow, searching. Then a man's voice called from outside, calm and familiar in a way that made Lillian's whole body go rigid. Lillian, Reverend Elias Rook said from beyond the door. Julian is worried about you. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. Julian reached for the handle. His mother caught his arm in both hands. Listen to me, she whispered, so close he could feel her shaking. The person who signed the paper to take me away was not a stranger. Julian turned toward her in the dark, and Lillian said, It was done in your name. For several seconds, nobody moved. The darkness inside the cave felt alive. Julian could hear water trickling somewhere deeper in the mountain. He could hear his own breathing. Most of all, he could hear Reverend Elias Rook waiting outside. Lillian's hands were still locked around his wrist. It was done in your name. The words hit harder than anything else that night. What does that mean? Julian whispered. It means the papers said you approved it. His stomach dropped. I never signed anything. I know. Outside, Rook knocked gently on the wooden door, not the knock of a man breaking in, the knock of a man who expected to be welcomed. Lillian, he called. Please, you don't need to hide. Julian felt anger rising through him, the calm voice, the concern, the performance. He started toward the door. Nora stepped in front of him. That's exactly what he wants. Julian stopped. He already knows she's here. Maybe, Nora said. But right now he doesn't know what she told you. The distinction mattered. Julian hated that it mattered. Outside, the footsteps shifted. Then silence returned. Eventually an engine started. A vehicle backed away. The sound disappeared into the mountains. Only then did Lillian finally release Julian's arm. She looked exhausted. Not confused. Not fragile. Exhausted. The difference suddenly seemed enormous. Nora relit the lantern. Warm light spread through the cave once more. Julian looked around properly for the first time. Rows of vegetables stretched through the chamber. Pale lettuce, spinach, herbs. small clusters of mushrooms growing along limestone walls. Water moved through shallow channels cut into stone. Nothing about it looked accidental. Someone had built this place carefully. Someone had understood exactly what they were doing. "This isn't possible," Julian murmured. Lillian almost smiled. That's what everyone said about Marin. The name again. Julian crouched beside one of the stone beds. Who exactly was she? His mother walked slowly toward a shelf carved into the rock wall. She removed an old lantern and brushed dust from the glass. "Most people called her crazy, and you?" "I called her family." The answer carried more weight than Julian expected. Lillian sat on a wooden stool. For the first time since finding her, she seemed willing to talk. Marin Voss lived out here alone for decades. People thought she was hiding from the world. Weren't she? No. Lillian looked around the cave. She was studying it. Julian followed her gaze. The stone, the water, the strange underground garden. "You mean farming? I mean understanding." The words lingered. Lillian pointed toward the ceiling. Marin believed the mountain could feed people. Julian looked up. Above them, faint shafts of reflected light bounced off old mirrors mounted high in the limestone. Most were dusty, some were cracked. Yet enough worked that the cave glowed with a soft silver haze, not bright, but alive. Julian felt something shift inside him. His company spent millions researching sustainable food systems. Entire teams of scientists studied controlled, growing environments. Yet an elderly woman everyone dismissed as eccentric had somehow created something remarkable beneath a mountain decades earlier. "How many people know about this place?" he asked. "Fewer every year." "Why?" Lillian hesitated. Then she gave him an answer that bothered him immediately. Because some people needed it forgotten. That was not the same thing as nobody knowing. It meant active erasure. Julian recognized the difference. He had seen it happen in business. When a story threatened profits, people didn't simply ignore it. They buried it. The thought brought him back to Rook. "What exactly did he want from you?" Lillian stared at the dirt floor. At first, she laughed softly, a sad laugh. "He wanted to help." Julian said nothing. "He brought groceries after my surgery, checked on me during storms, fixed things around the property." Then what changed? He started asking questions. About what? The land. The answer came immediately. Too immediately. Lillian noticed him noticing. He always seemed interested in Blind Hollow. Julian looked around the cave again. For the first time he stopped seeing an eccentric underground garden. He started seeing real estate. 12 acres, a limestone formation, water access, agricultural potential, development potential. Suddenly, the cave felt less mysterious and more valuable. "What land records exist for this place?" he asked. Lillian's face tightened. "There used to be more." "Used to, not anymore." Julian sat beside her. "What happened?" For several moments she did not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. Things began disappearing. A chill moved through him. "What things?" "Old journals, maps, surveyed documents." Julian frowned. "Who took them?" "I don't know." But she didn't sound convinced. Julian noticed that too. Nora suddenly spoke from across the chamber. He had keys. Both of them turned toward her. Nora crossed her arms. He had access to her cabin whenever he wanted. Lillian closed her eyes. The silence was answer enough. Julian felt his pulse quicken. "Rook?" Neither woman answered. They didn't need to. The cave suddenly felt much colder. Julian stood and walked slowly through the rows of crops. His flashlight moved across stone walls, across channels carrying clear water, across old shelves lined with rusted tools. Then the beam stopped. Something was wrong. He stepped closer. The wall ahead wasn't natural. At first glance it looked like the rest of the limestone. But the texture was different. The stones were newer. The mortar looked cleaner. Someone had built part of this wall. Recently. Nora. She looked up. Julian pointed. "What is that?" Her expression changed immediately. Lillian rose from the stool. For a long moment neither woman spoke. Finally Nora muttered a curse under her breath. "That wasn't there last year." Julian moved closer. The wall stretched across a narrow opening leading deeper into the cave. Not huge, but deliberate. A barrier, a blockage. Someone had sealed off part of the mountain. Lillian's face had gone pale. "No." Julian turned. "What?" Her eyes never left the wall. "That leads to the back chamber." "The back chamber?" Her breathing had become shallow. Marin kept records there. Julian stared. "What kind of records?" Lillian swallowed. "The kind somebody wanted hidden." Silence settled over the cave. Julian stepped toward the sealed opening. His flashlight found something near the base of the new stonework. A scrape, fresh, recent, not decades old, not even years old. Someone had worked here not long ago. He knelt, ran his fingers across the mark. Then he noticed something else. A faint sound coming from beyond the wall. At first he thought it was wind, then water. Then he realized neither explanation fit. Because the sound wasn't natural. It came in short bursts. Metal against stone. A deliberate rhythm. Someone was on the other side, and whoever it was had just heard them arrive. The sound stopped the moment Julian's flashlight landed on the wall. Nobody spoke. The cave seemed to hold its breath with them. Julian remained crouched beside the fresh stonework, listening. The metal scraping he had heard only seconds earlier was gone. Whatever, or whoever, had been making it now understood they were no longer alone. Nora moved beside him and pressed her palm against the wall. It's hollow back there. Lillian's face tightened. It wasn't sealed when Marin was alive. Julian ran the beam slowly across the mortar. The stone itself looked old enough to blend into the cave, but the joints between the blocks told a different story. The material was cleaner, less worn. Someone had rebuilt this section intentionally, and recently. Can we open it? He asked. Nora shook her head. Not tonight. Why? Because whoever sealed it knew what they were doing. She pointed toward the ceiling. The limestone above the wall was fractured. Not dangerously, not yet, but enough to make an amateur mistake costly. Julian hated the answer. His entire career had been built around solving problems quickly. If something broke, he hired experts. If information was missing, he bought access to it. If a deadline threatened a project, he threw resources at it until the obstacle disappeared. This cave did not care about any of that. Neither did the mountain. Lillian suddenly swayed. Julian caught her arm. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was fading. Her face had lost color. You need to sit down. I'm fine. You haven't slept. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped, because they both knew he was right. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Julian realized he could not remember the last time he had told his mother what she needed instead of listening to what others said she needed. That realization hurt. Not because she looked fragile, because she looked tired. There was a difference. An hour later they left the cave. Nora led them through a narrow path climbing the hillside above the limestone entrance. The old cabin appeared between the trees, small and weather-beaten but still standing. A single room. A rusted stove, shelves packed with jars and notebooks. The place smelled of cedar, dust, and old paper. Lillian seemed calmer the moment she crossed the threshold. Julian noticed she trusted this place. More than the facility, more than the people who claimed to care for her. That fact alone said enough. While Nora started a fire, Julian stepped outside and finally found enough signal to make calls. The first was to his attorney in Charleston. The second was to a private investigator his company occasionally used during acquisition disputes. The third was to the physician who had treated Lillian. He spent nearly 40 minutes gathering facts. Each conversation left him more disturbed. No emergency medical recommendation existed. No diagnosis justified long-term restrictions on family contact. No physician had requested guardianship. Nothing matched the story he had been given. When he returned inside, Lillian was sitting at the table studying him. You called people. I did. What did they say? Julian pulled out a chair. They said you shouldn't have been isolated. Her eyes closed. Not in surprise, in confirmation, as if she had already known. The silence that followed felt heavier than anger. It felt like betrayal. Not from Julian, from an entire system. The fire crackled softly. Finally Lillian stood and walked toward an old cabinet beside the stove. She reached into the bottom drawer and removed a metal lockbox. Julian immediately recognized it. It was old, heavy, and clearly important. What is that? Her expression changed. For the first time all evening, fear gave way to determination. This is why I left. She carried the box to the table. The metal was scratched and worn. The lock had been replaced more than once. Someone had protected it for years. Lillian placed a key into the latch, then hesitated. Julian noticed her hands shaking. Not from age, from memory. There are things in here I never wanted you involved in. What things? The kind that make powerful people nervous. The lock clicked open. Inside were folders, survey maps, property records, handwritten notebooks, receipts, letters, years of them. Julian stared. This wasn't a keepsake collection. It was an archive. a deliberate archive. Someone had been preserving evidence. Lillian lifted a faded envelope from the bottom. Marin believed people would eventually come for the land. Why? Because she understood what was underneath it. Julian frowned. The cave? Lillian nodded. And the water. Julian remembered the channels running through the underground garden, the constant flow, the mineral-rich limestone. The pieces began fitting together. Not completely, but enough. Someone wants the property. Yes, Rook? Not just Rook. That answer landed harder than expected. Julian leaned forward. What do you mean? Lillian slid a folded survey map across the table. The paper was yellow with age. Recent notes had been added in blue ink. Julian unfolded it. His eyes moved across property boundaries, road easements, water routes, then stopped. A red circle had been drawn around Blind Hollow. Beside it was a company name, one Julian recognized immediately, Greystone Materials. One of the largest quarry operators in the region. His stomach tightened. What is this doing here? Lillian looked away. They've been trying to buy surrounding parcels for years. Julian understood at once. A quarry, the limestone, the water access, the mountain, everything suddenly made economic sense, and that frightened him more than superstition ever could, because money created patient enemies, the kind who waited years, the kind who smiled while they waited, the kind who attended church breakfasts and charity fundraisers while planning transactions nobody else could see. Julian studied the map again, then noticed something else. Several pages beneath it contained photocopies of signatures. Different signatures, different dates, the same name, Julian Voss. His pulse quickened. Some looked genuine, did not. He lifted one sheet, then another. The inconsistencies became obvious. The angle, the pressure, the spacing. Someone had been practicing, or reproducing. His mother watched his expression carefully. You see it now. Julian looked up. These aren't all yours. No. The fire popped loudly behind them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Julian asked the question he had been avoiding. Do you think somebody forged your signature? Lillian's answer came immediately. I think somebody needed me to stop saying no. The room went silent. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Inside, Julian turned over another document, then another, until he found one that made him freeze. It wasn't a survey, it wasn't a financial record, it was a copy of a trust document. Across the top in faded type were 3 words, Voss Agricultural Trust, and across the bottom someone had stamped it, amended, but half the final page was missing. Julian stared at the torn trust document for a long time. The missing section was not an accident. The tear ran cleanly across the page, removing exactly the language that would have explained the amendment's purpose. Whoever had done it knew where the important information was. Lillian sat across from him, watching his face. They took the ending, she said quietly. Julian looked up. Who? I don't know. But I know when. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms against the cold. It was still complete when I moved the box here 3 years ago. Nora stopped sorting papers. 3 years? Lillian nodded. Before Reverend Rook started visiting every week. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The implication was obvious, but implication wasn't proof. Julian knew better than to confuse suspicion with evidence. That mistake could destroy everything. He carefully photographed every document inside the lockbox and uploaded copies to a secure server. Then he created duplicate backups. For the first time since arriving in Blind Hollow, he felt less like a worried son and more like someone preparing for a fight. A legal fight. A public fight. Maybe both. Near midnight, Nora left for home. The mountain roads would become dangerous if the temperature dropped much further. Before leaving, she handed Julian a business card, not her own. A retired extension agent named Ruth Calloway. She remembers everything around here, Nora said. If anybody knows about Marin Voss, it'll be Ruth. After Nora disappeared into the darkness, silence settled over the cabin. Lillian sat near the stove reading one of Marin's notebooks. Julian sat across from her reviewing scanned records. Hours passed, then something strange appeared. The same parcel number kept surfacing. Different surveys, different years, different ownership discussions, always the same land, the cave, the surrounding acreage, the spring, again and again. Julian frowned. A quarry company trying to buy limestone land wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how many times the effort had failed. 5 attempts, 6, maybe more, each one abandoned before completion, as if something kept blocking the sale, or someone. At 2 in the morning, he finally closed the laptop. "Mom," Lillian looked up. "When did you first meet Rook?" The question lingered between them. She stared into the stove before answering. "About 6 years ago, before the care facility, long before Julian waited. He came after your father died." The mention of his father still carried weight, even after all these years. Lillian's eyes remained on the fire. "He offered help with what? Everything." Her voice hardened. "Paperwork, repairs, transportation, church outreach." Julian understood the pattern immediately. People trusted men like Rook because they arrived when grief weakened judgment. They became indispensable, then invisible, until nobody remembered when they gained influence. He wasn't the only one helping. No. Then why him? Lillian gave a sad smile. Because everyone else eventually went home. That answer hurt more than Julian expected, because he heard the accusation hidden inside it. Not toward Rook, toward himself. He had sent money, he had paid bills, he had arranged care. He had assumed those things were enough. Now he wasn't so sure. The next morning brought rain. Cold Appalachian rain that turned roads into rivers of mud. Julian drove into town alone. He left Lillian at the cabin despite her protests, not because he wanted control, because somebody had already tried controlling her, and until he understood how far that control reached, he wasn't risking her safety. Blind Hollow looked different during daylight, smaller, poorer, more tired. Boarded storefronts stood beside struggling businesses. Several buildings carried banners supporting a regional development initiative, the same initiative connected to the quarry proposal. Julian noticed Reverend Rook's name repeatedly. Fundraisers, economic recovery events, community investment meetings. His influence was everywhere. That was what made him dangerous. Not power alone, trust. Julian eventually found Ruth Calloway's house near the edge of town. An old farmhouse sat behind a line of maple trees. The woman who answered the door looked to be in her 70s, sharp eyes, firm posture. The expression of someone who had spent decades correcting bad information. When Julian introduced himself, she studied him for several moments, then stepped aside. I wondered how long it'd take before somebody came asking about Marin. The inside of her home felt more like an archive than a residence. Shelves overflowed with agricultural journals, historical records, county maps, boxes labeled by year. Ruth motioned toward a dining table. "Sit." Julian did. She placed a faded newspaper clipping between them. The article was old enough that parts had yellowed. The headline mentioned winter vegetables. The accompanying photograph showed several adults standing beside crates of produce. Julian examined it carefully. One woman stood in the center, strong posture, dark coat, direct eyes. Julian Voss, the legendary woman most of Blind Hollow now treated as folklore. "People called her crazy," Ruth said. "They usually do that when a woman succeeds before everyone else understands why." Julian looked up. "You knew her?" "I worked with her." That surprised him. Ruth smiled. "Most people think the cave story is mythology. It isn't. Not even close." She opened another folder. Inside were crop reports, yield records, weather summaries, agricultural notes, real documentation, not stories, evidence. Marin had grown food underground during years when surface farms failed. Not every season, not every, but enough. Enough to matter, enough to save people. Julian felt something shift. The cave was becoming larger than a family dispute, larger than property, larger than money. Then Ruth handed him another document. This one changed everything. It was a county planning map, a recent one. Julian immediately recognized the quarry expansion outline. The highlighted zone stretched farther than he expected, much farther. His eyes followed the border, then stopped. The proposed excavation area overlapped part of the cave system. A cold feeling spread through him. "They knew," he said. Ruth nodded. "They've always known. They aren't buying the land despite the cave." "No," she leaned forward. "They want the land because of the cave." Julian stared at her. "What are you not telling me?" For the first time, uncertainty crossed Ruth's face. She walked to a filing cabinet near the wall, unlocked the bottom drawer, removed a sealed envelope, then returned slowly. This came from Marin. Julian looked at the handwriting, the date, the aging paper. His pulse quickened. "What is it, a letter? To who?" Ruth hesitated, long enough to make him nervous. Then she placed the envelope in front of him. The name written across the front wasn't Ruth's, it wasn't Lillian's, and it wasn't Reverend Rook's. It was his father's. Julian Voss froze. His father had died years ago. Yet someone had hidden a letter addressed specifically to him. A letter Marin never wanted filed with county records. A letter preserved in secret for decades. Ruth swallowed. Marin told me never to open it unless somebody tried to take the cave. Julian looked down at the envelope. His father's name stared back at him. And across the lower corner, written in smaller handwriting, were 6 words that made his stomach drop. For the truth about your family. Julian did not open the envelope at Ruth Calloway's table. For several seconds he simply stared at his father's name. The handwriting belonged to Marin Voss. Ruth was certain of that. She had seen dozens of Marin's journals over the years. The same careful strokes, the same habit of pressing harder on the final letter of a word. But that only deepened the mystery. Why would Marin write a letter to a man who had never spoken about her, and why hide it for decades? You should read it somewhere private, Ruth said quietly. Julian nodded. His instincts agreed. Whatever waited inside that envelope had survived longer than some marriages and entire businesses. It deserved caution. He slipped it into his jacket. Then he looked back at the quarry map. Who else knows about this? About the cave? Ruth asked. No, about what's underneath it. Ruth hesitated. That answer told him enough. Someone does. A few people suspect. She admitted. Don't. Julian's pulse quickened. What exactly are they suspecting? Ruth folded her hands. That Marin wasn't growing vegetables down there just to feed people. The room became very still. Julian waited. Ruth shook her head. I don't know more than that. She never trusted governments, never trusted mining companies. And near the end of her life, she trusted almost nobody. That wasn't an answer, but it was another piece, and every piece seemed connected to the cave. Back at the cabin, rain hammered the roof. Lillian sat near the stove sorting old notebooks. The moment Julian entered, she looked up. She immediately noticed the envelope. Color drained from her face. Where did you get that, Ruth? Lillian stood, not slowly. Not like an elderly woman struggling with age, like someone reacting to a gunshot.
Ruth still had it?
Julian stared at her. You knew about this? Lillian looked away, and that told him more than words. You knew. I knew it existed. You never told me. I never saw it. Julian's frustration surfaced before he could stop it. Mom, every time I get close to understanding what's happening, I find another secret. The words hung between them. Pain flashed across her face. Not anger. Pain. Immediately, he regretted the tone. Lillian lowered herself back into the chair. When your father was alive, he asked me never to go looking for that letter. Julian blinked. What? He said if Marin wanted him to have it, she'd make sure he got it. That makes no sense. It didn't then either. The rain grew louder. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Julian carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside had yellowed with age. Marin's handwriting covered 3 pages. He began reading. The first paragraph made no sense. The second made even less. Marin wrote about limestone formations, water movement, underground chambers, survey markers. Then she mentioned his father, not casually, specifically. She warned him that if anyone ever attempted to buy Blind Hollow, he must assume the cave was the true target. Not the land, not the timber, the cave. Julian continued reading. By the second page his heart was racing. Marin believed someone would eventually try to erase evidence hidden beneath the property. Evidence connected to ownership. Evidence connected to families. Evidence connected to agreements that had never been properly recorded. Then came a sentence that stopped him cold. Your family was protected by a promise, not a deed. Julian read it twice, 3 times, still confusing. What does that mean? Lillian shook her head. I don't know, he continued. The letter never fully explained. Instead, it referenced another location, a place called Chamber 3. Julian frowned. He had explored most of the cave already. 2 chambers, not 3. The final page contained a rough drawing, part map, part diagram, and at the bottom Marin had written, "If the promise is ever broken, look beneath the stone that carries no name." Julian slowly lowered the paper. What promise? No answer came. Only silence. The next morning he returned to the cave before sunrise. Lillian insisted on coming. So did Nora. The 3 of them entered together carrying flashlights and copies of Marin's sketch. The familiar chambers looked unchanged. Water moved through the channels. The surviving crops remained alive. But now Julian saw everything differently. Not as a farm, as a puzzle, a hidden structure designed by someone expecting future threats. For 2 hours they searched. Nothing. No hidden passage, no marked stone, no third chamber. Frustration built. Then Nora stopped near the rear wall. What about this? Julian turned. She pointed toward a section of limestone partially covered by mineral deposits. At first glance it looked natural. Then he noticed something. Straight edges, not perfectly straight, but straighter than nature usually made. He stepped closer, ran his hand along the surface. A hollow sound answered. All three exchanged looks. Nora fetched a small hammer from her tool bag, one careful strike, then another. The echo changed, definitely hollow. Someone had sealed something. The discovery should have felt exciting. Instead, Julian felt dread, because sealed spaces existed for a reason, sometimes to protect something, sometimes to hide it. Together they began clearing mineral buildup. Hours passed. Slow work, careful work, no reckless digging. Eventually the outline appeared, a doorway, old, very old, hidden behind decades of limestone growth. Lillian stared at it with tears in her eyes. She never told me, Julian swallowed. Even after everything, Marin had still kept secrets. They managed to open a narrow gap before darkness forced them to stop. Cold air flowed out, stale, undisturbed. The passage beyond disappeared into blackness. No one entered. Not yet. They needed equipment, support braces, safety measures. Julian refused to rush, especially after the sabotage they had already discovered. As they prepared to leave, his phone vibrated. Dana Mercer, the probate attorney. Julian answered immediately. Her voice sounded tense. Where are you? At the cave. Good. Don't leave your mother alone. His stomach tightened. What happened? I found something. Not the words anyone wanted to hear. What? The trust records. Julian waited. Dana exhaled slowly. The amendment wasn't just removed from county files. A pause. A bad one. It looks like someone replaced entire sections of the record years ago. Julian felt the ground shift beneath him. Replaced? Multiple entries. Different dates. Different handwriting. Different filing references. Can you prove it? Maybe. Not yes. Not yet. What aren't you telling me? Silence. Then Dana spoke. The original alterations appear to have happened before Reverend Rook ever became involved. Julian stopped walking. Rain dripped from the cave entrance. Beside him, Lillian slowly turned. Neither spoke, because both understood what that meant. If Dana was right off, then the conspiracy was older, much older. And Reverend Rook might not have started it. He might have inherited it. Then Dana delivered the final blow. The earliest suspicious signature belongs to someone with the last name Voss. The call ended. And for the first time since finding his mother, Julian began to wonder whether the person who had hidden the truth wasn't outside his family at all. It might have been inside it. Julian barely slept. The revelation from Dana sat in his mind like a stone. A Voss, not Reverend Rook, not a county clerk, not some anonymous bureaucrat. A Voss. Someone carrying the same family name had altered records long before Rook ever gained influence in Blind Hollow. The rain stopped sometime before dawn. When Julian stepped outside the cabin, fog drifted through the valley in pale ribbons. The limestone entrance stood silent across the clearing. For the first time, he wondered whether the cave had been hiding his family from the truth instead of hiding the truth from outsiders. Lillian joined him on the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Julian broke the silence. Was my father ever involved with the trust? Lillian's expression changed. Not guilt, not fear, recognition. She had known this question was coming. He wanted nothing to do with it. Julian frowned. Nothing? He respected Marin. That's not what I asked. Lillian stared into her coffee. Your father believed the cave caused problems. Julian felt irritation rise. Everyone says that. He didn't mean the farming. What then? The secrets. That answer landed harder than he expected. Lillian looked toward the cave. Marin spent her life protecting something. Do you know what? No, the answer came too quickly. Julian noticed it immediately. So did she. For several seconds they simply looked at each other. Then Lillian sighed. I know part of it. Julian waited. The cave wasn't only about food. A pause. Marin believed certain people had no right to own Blind Hollow. The words lingered. Julian leaned forward. What people? People who viewed it as a resource instead of a responsibility. It sounded philosophical. Too philosophical. The kind of answer people gave when avoiding a more specific one. Before he could press further, a truck pulled into the clearing. Dana Mercer. She stepped out carrying 2 banker boxes. Julian immediately knew she had found something. People only carried that much paper when trouble got bigger. Inside the cabin, Dana spread documents across the table: county records, property maps, trust filings, historical surveys. Everything looked ordinary until she began aligning dates. Then the pattern emerged. Several filings had been altered, not dramatically. Small changes. Tiny adjustments, descriptions shortened, boundary references removed, supporting attachments missing, individually meaningless, together devastating. This wasn't one forgery, Dana said. It was maintenance. Julian frowned. What does that mean? It means someone kept returning to the records every few years. She pointed at multiple entries, different handwriting, different pens, different clerks, but the same goal. Lillian slowly sat down. Dana continued. Every alteration reduced the legal importance of the cave. The room fell quiet. Even now, decades later, someone had been protecting the same lie. Julian felt a chill. That kind of commitment wasn't about money alone. It never was. People maintained lies like this because the truth threatened identity. Family, legacy, power, something bigger. Dana opened another folder. Inside were photographs, not family pictures, historical county archive photographs, buildings, meetings, community events. One photograph immediately caught Julian's attention. A dedication ceremony from the late 1970s. Several local leaders stood together. Among them was a younger Reverend Rook, but Julian barely noticed him. His eyes locked onto another face, a man standing beside Rook, a man wearing a suit, a man Julian recognized instantly. His father's silence filled the room. Lillian closed her eyes. She didn't look surprised. That was worse. Julian slowly picked up the photograph. My father knew him. Lillian didn't answer. He knew Rook, still silence. Dana glanced between them. Clearly she had stepped into something personal. Julian looked back at his mother. How long? Lillian swallowed. Years. The words struck like a hammer. Julian stared at the photograph. His father and Rook looked comfortable together. Not strangers, not casual acquaintances, partners, friends, something. The image shattered years of assumptions. His father had always been described as distant from local politics, detached from community power struggles, focused on work, focused on family. Apparently not. What aren't you telling me? Lillian stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor. For a moment, Julian thought she might walk away. Instead, she moved toward a bookshelf, reached behind a row of journals, removed a thin leather notebook. The notebook looked old, very old. She placed it on the table. Her hands trembled. Your father kept this, Julian. A private stared at it. Not many entries, mostly notes, dates, meetings, names. The first pages revealed nothing. Then he found references to Marin, then references to county officials, then references to surveys. The deeper he read, the worse it became. His father had been investigating something. Not helping conceal it, investigating it. Julian looked up sharply. Wait. He flipped backward, then forward again. The notes didn't fit the story forming in his head. His father wasn't protecting the alterations. He was documenting them, page after page, questions, concerns, missing records, contradictions. It resembled the work of someone trying to uncover a conspiracy, not participate in one. Dana leaned closer. What year is that? Julian checked. 1998. Dana's expression tightened. That's before most of the alterations I found. The realization hit everyone simultaneously. His father had noticed the fraud decades ago. Before Rook's rise, before the care facility, before the quarry proposal, before everything. Lillian sat down again. This time she looked exhausted. He tried to stop it. Julian's heart pounded. What happened? He got scared. The answer surprised him. His father had never seemed afraid of anything. Lillian gave a bitter laugh. Everyone is brave until they realize how many people benefit from a lie. The words settled heavily across the room. Julian returned to the notebook. Near the back, several pages had been removed. Cleanly cut out, not torn, removed intentionally. Someone had wanted specific information gone. Then he found a folded slip of paper tucked into the binding, a note written in his father's hand. Just one sentence. If anything happens to me, trust Marin. Julian read it twice, 3 times. A strange sadness washed through him. His father had been dead for years. Yet somehow he had just spoken. Outside, wind rattled the cabin windows. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then Dana noticed something. A symbol, small, almost invisible, pressed into the bottom corner of the notebook. Not handwriting, an embossed seal. She froze. Julian, he looked over. What? Dana pointed. I've seen that before. She grabbed one of the county record copies, compared the two. The same seal appeared faintly on an altered filing, not a government seal, not a legal stamp. Something else, a private mark, a symbol of ownership or membership or affiliation. Dana's face went pale. That's impossible, what is it? She looked directly at Julian. The seal belongs to the original Blind Hollow Development Society. Nobody recognized the name, except Lillian. The moment she heard it, she went completely still. Julian noticed immediately, "Mom." No answer. Slowly she looked up. Fear filled her eyes, not ordinary fear, old fear, the kind buried for decades. Then she whispered 5 words that changed everything again. They weren't supposed to exist. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Lillian's words. They weren't supposed to exist. The sentence lingered in the cabin like a warning. Julian watched his mother carefully. He had seen her frightened before. He had seen her exhausted, angry, and heartbroken. This was different. The fear in her eyes belonged to something much older than Reverend Rook or the quarry deal. Dana slowly closed the notebook. "Lillian," she said softly, "what was the Blind Hollow Development Society?" Lillian looked toward the window. Fog still hung over the valley, wrapping the limestone ridge in pale gray shadows. It started before Rook. Julian immediately sat forward. How long before? Generations. The answer surprised everyone. Lillian folded her hands together as if trying to keep them from shaking. People think Blind Hollow stayed poor because nobody invested in it. That's not true. Investors came many times. Julian listened carefully. They wanted timber, coal, limestone, water rights. Her voice grew quieter. Every generation somebody wanted to own the valley. Dana glanced at the seal again. And this society, they brought those people together. Julian frowned. "You mean businessmen?" "Businessmen, politicians, land speculators." A bitter smile crossed her face. "And sometimes preachers." The room fell silent again. For the first time, Reverend Rook seemed less like the architect of the conspiracy and more like its latest caretaker. Julian hated that realization. It meant the problem was larger than one corrupt man. It meant removing Rook might not end anything. Dana opened her laptop. "I want to verify something." She began searching through archived non-profit filings and historical corporate records. Several minutes passed. Then she found a reference. The organization had officially dissolved nearly 40 years earlier, at least on paper. Julian almost laughed. Nothing in Blind Hollow seemed to stay dead. Dana kept reading. The society had once sponsored infrastructure studies, mining assessments, and land development proposals across 3 counties. Its last recorded chairman had died decades ago, yet somehow its seal had appeared on modern record alterations. That was impossible, unless somebody had continued operating behind the scenes. Julian felt his pulse quicken. His father had known, Marin had known, Lillian had known enough to fear it. The question was why. What exactly were they hiding, he asked. Lillian looked at him. "The cave." Julian sighed. "We already know they wanted the land." "No." Her voice sharpened. "They wanted the cave specifically." That got his attention. Dana looked up from her screen. "Why?" Lillian slowly stood and walked toward the old map hanging beside the fireplace. The same map she had shown Julian days earlier. The cave system stretched beneath a huge portion of Blind Hollow. Most people saw tunnels. Most people saw rock. Lillian pointed at several markings. Marin discovered something. Julian exchanged a glance with Dana. Neither spoke. Lillian touched one section of the map. "Water." Dana frowned. "An underground aquifer?" Lillian nodded. "One of the largest natural freshwater reserves in this region." The room went quiet. Julian suddenly understood why mining companies would care, why land developers would care, why county officials might care. Water was worth more than limestone, more than crops, more than almost anything, especially during drought years. Dana immediately began taking notes. Was it documented? Partly. Where? Marin's journals. Julian felt frustration rise. Then why didn't anyone use it? Lillian gave a sad laugh. Because Marin didn't trust them. The government, the companies, the county, a pause, almost everyone. Julian looked toward the cave. The underground garden suddenly seemed much bigger than farming. Marin hadn't built it only to grow food. She had protected an entire resource, one capable of changing the valley's future. And that meant the amendment wasn't merely about preserving tradition. It was about controlling access to something incredibly valuable. The realization made Julian uncomfortable, because it also changed how he viewed his own family. Had generations of Vosses been protecting the community or controlling it? Sometimes those two things looked very similar. The afternoon passed with more questions than answers. Dana photographed every page of the journal. Julian scanned the removed sections for impressions or pressure marks. Lillian rested in a chair near the stove, exhausted from reopening memories she had spent years trying to bury. Near sunset, Nora Pike arrived. Mud covered her boots. She looked irritated. That was usually a bad sign. Without even sitting down, she dropped a county maintenance report onto the table. I found something. Everyone gathered around. The report listed inspection work performed near Blind Hollow 6 months earlier. Officially, it involved drainage maintenance. Unofficially, it raised immediate concerns. Several access routes leading toward the cave had been surveyed. Not repaired, surveyed. Julian read the names attached to the report. 2 county employees, 1 retired supervisor, and a consultant from a geological firm. Dana pointed at the consulting company. I know them. Julian looked up. They're connected to the quarry proposal? Indirectly. Her expression darkened. They've worked for the same investment group. The room became very still. Now there was a timeline. Months before Lillian disappeared. Months before the closure order. Months before the public campaign began. People connected to the quarry had already been studying the cave. Planning, preparing, waiting. The operation had started long before anyone admitted the quarry existed. Julian felt anger rising again. Not the explosive anger he felt when he first found his mother. Something colder, more focused. Somebody had spent years manipulating records, trust documents, inspections, medical reports, and public opinion. This wasn't opportunistic corruption, it was strategy. Nora folded her arms. That's not the worst part. Everyone looked at her. She slid another paper across the table, an invoice. Julian immediately recognized the name at the top, the Church Development Fund. A payment had been issued to the geological consultant, not large enough to attract attention, just enough to appear routine. Dana stared at the document, then looked at Julian. Rook funded part of the survey. Lillian closed her eyes. Not because she was surprised, because she had expected this moment for years. Darkness settled outside. The group worked late into the evening. Every new document seemed to confirm the same pattern. Money moved quietly. Records changed gradually. Public stories shifted carefully. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough pressure over enough years. The kind of corruption that survived because it never appeared all at once. Near midnight, Dana finally packed her files. We have enough to challenge the closure order. Julian nodded. But not enough to prove the larger conspiracy. No, not yet. The words hung in the air. Not yet. That phrase had followed them from the beginning. Not enough evidence. Not enough witnesses. Not enough records. Always one step away from certainty. After everyone left, Julian remained awake. The cabin was silent. Lillian had gone to bed hours earlier. The notebook sat alone on the kitchen table. He found himself staring at it. Something still bothered him. The missing pages. His father had removed them, or someone else had. Either way, those pages mattered. He opened the notebook again, carefully, page by page. Near the back, tucked deep inside the binding where Dana had missed it, he felt something, a thin object. Julian carefully pulled it free. A photograph, old, faded, hidden for decades. His breath caught. The photograph showed several adults standing beside the limestone entrance. Marin Voss stood in the center. Beside her stood a group of men in suits. One of them was clearly identified on the back. Chairman, Blind Hollow Development Society. Another carried no name, yet Julian recognized him instantly. Not because he had met him, because he had seen the face earlier that day. In county archives, in old meeting records, in photographs linked to the first alterations of the trust. The same man appeared again and again throughout 50 years of documents, but that wasn't what made Julian's blood run cold. Written beneath the photograph, in Marin's handwriting, was a sentence she had wanted someone to find, a sentence directed at the future. If they ever come back for the water, do not trust the Voss who helps them. Julian did not sleep. The photograph remained on the kitchen table until dawn, illuminated by a single lamp. He read Marin's handwritten warning again and again. If they ever come back for the water, do not trust the Voss who helps them. Every time he read it, the same question surfaced. Which Voss? Marin had not written a name. She had not written a date. She had left only enough information to plant doubt, and it worked. By sunrise, Julian found himself questioning things he had never questioned before: his father, his grandfather, even himself. When Lillian entered the kitchen the next morning, she immediately noticed the photograph. The color drained from her face. For a long moment she simply stared. Then she sat down, slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a grave. "You found it." Julian nodded. "You knew it existed. I hoped it was gone." That answer surprised him. Lillian reached for the photograph but stopped before touching it. Marin hid several things before she died. Some were meant to be found, some weren't. Julian pointed to the sentence. Who was she talking about? Lillian looked away. "I don't know." The answer sounded honest. That frightened him more. Because if even Lillian didn't know, the warning might have outlived everyone who understood it. Dana arrived less than an hour later. When she saw the photograph, she immediately asked to scan it. Within minutes, she had enlarged the image on her laptop. The details became clearer. Several faces were recognizable from county archives. One was the chairman of the old Blind Hollow Development Society. Another had family connections to an early mining company. A third had served on a regional land commission. The deeper Dana looked, the worse it became. The photograph was not a casual gathering. It was a network, a coalition. People with money, influence, and access. People whose descendants still lived throughout the region. Nora arrived shortly afterward carrying coffee and fresh copies of county records. The moment she saw the image, she froze. "What?" Julian asked. She pointed toward a man standing near the edge of the group. Not the chairman, not one of the officials. Someone partially hidden, a younger man, almost forgotten. "I know that face." Dana looked up from where Nora frowned. "I've seen him recently." That made no sense. The photograph was decades old, yet Nora remained certain. After several moments, she grabbed her phone and began searching through photos she had taken during county meetings. Finally, she stopped. Her eyes widened. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." She turned the screen around. The resemblance was undeniable. The older man in the photograph and a current member of the county development board shared the same face structure, same eyes, same jawline. Not the same person, a direct relative, a son or nephew, maybe both. The room grew quiet. The conspiracy suddenly felt less historical. The people behind it had not disappeared. Their families had inherited their positions, inherited their influence, possibly inherited their goals. Julian felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Generational corruption was harder to fight than individual corruption. You couldn't expose one person and expect the system to collapse. The system simply replaced them. Dana leaned back in her chair. "This changes the hearing." "How?" Julian asked. "Because now we're not dealing with an isolated conflict of interest." She tapped the photograph. "We're looking at a pattern." Lillian listened silently. Her hands rested in her lap. For the first time in days, she seemed less afraid. Not because the danger was smaller, because the truth was finally taking shape. Fear became easier to bear when it had a face. The group spent most of the day organizing evidence, harvest records, trust documents, quarry communications, survey reports, financial transfers, every piece connected to another, a web instead of a straight line. By afternoon, Dana received a call from the historical archive. The notary ledger had been fully authenticated. The amendment referenced by Marin had existed exactly as Ruth claimed. That alone represented a major breakthrough. Yet Dana sounded troubled after ending the call. "What is it?" Julian asked. The archivist found something else. Her expression tightened. "A correspondence file." Julian frowned. "Related to Marin? Related to the trust?" Everyone moved closer. Dana opened an email containing scanned documents. Most were ordinary administrative letters, property descriptions, boundary discussions, routine legal language. Then she reached the final page. Silence filled the room. The letter had been written decades ago, addressed to Julian Voss, signed by an attorney. One paragraph immediately stood out. "If any future trustee seeks to transfer ownership rights to entities connected to the Development Society, the trust shall require review under the Supplemental Protection Clause." Julian read it twice, then a third time. "Supplemental Protection Clause?" Dana nodded slowly. "That's not in the amendment we found." Lillian looked confused. "It should be." Dana zoomed in. The letter clearly referenced language that did not appear anywhere in their recovered documents, which meant one of two things. Either the attorney had made a mistake, or another version existed, a longer version, a version nobody had found. Julian immediately felt both excitement and dread. Another missing document, another layer beneath the layer they had just uncovered. The pattern was becoming familiar. Every answer opened a larger question. Nora folded her arms. If there's a second version, where is it? Nobody had an answer, but Lillian suddenly stood. The movement surprised everyone. I might. All eyes turned toward her. For several seconds she hesitated. Then she walked toward the old map hanging on the wall. Not the cave map, another one. A faded survey chart that had remained largely ignored. She pointed toward a section near the southern boundary. Marin used to call this place the second door. Julian frowned. There isn't a second cave entrance, there is. Lillian met his eyes. It was sealed before I was born. The room became completely still. Lillian took a slow breath. Marin believed one entrance wasn't enough. She always prepared backups. Dana's pulse visibly quickened. You're saying there may be another chamber, maybe. And documents could be stored there, maybe. The uncertainty should have frustrated Julian. Instead, it energized him. For the first time since finding his mother, they were no longer reacting. They were pursuing, following evidence instead of chasing damage. That feeling lasted less than an hour, because just before sunset, Dana received another call. This one came from a contact inside county administration. She listened silently, asked 3 questions, then ended the conversation. Nobody needed to ask whether the news was bad. Her face already answered. What happened? Julian said. Dana looked directly at him. The emergency guardianship petition. Julian's stomach dropped. What about it? It was amended this afternoon. Lillian stiffened. Dana swallowed. Rook isn't asking the court to evaluate your mother's capacity anymore. Silence. Then Julian spoke. What is he asking for? Dana looked down at her notes. When she raised her eyes again, her voice was barely above a whisper. He's asking the court to appoint a temporary conservator immediately. Julian's expression darkened. Who? Dana turned the paper around. At the bottom of the filing was a name none of them expected. A name connected neither to the care facility nor the church. A name that appeared nowhere in their investigation, yet somehow carried the same surname as Julian. The proposed conservator was listed as Thomas Voss. Thomas Voss arrived at the emergency hearing in a navy suit and an expression of practiced concern. Julian recognized him before anyone introduced them. Not from family gatherings. There had never been many of those. Thomas belonged to the branch of the Voss family that had always kept distance, polite enough at funerals, invisible when anything needed courage. He was a third cousin, a real estate consultant, and now somehow the man Reverend Rook wanted appointed to control Lillian's decisions. Lillian sat beside Dana at the council table. She looked tired but not broken. When Thomas glanced at her, he did not look at a relative. He looked at a property problem. That was when Julian understood why Rook had chosen him. Thomas stood when the judge entered. His attorney argued that Lillian had been unstable, that she had left a safe facility without authorization, that she had placed herself in danger inside an unsafe limestone cave. Rook sat 2 rows behind him, hands folded, face solemn, as though grief had personally asked him to be there. Then Dana stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She presented facts. The independent physician had evaluated Lillian that morning. His written report stated that she understood her medical condition, her property interests, her legal choices, and the consequences of those choices. He found no basis for emergency conservatorship. The facility manager tried to soften her role at first. Then Dana placed internal notes beside the doctor's records. The notes called Lillian confused on days when no nurse had recorded confusion, and restricted her calls after entries marked per Reverend Rook's request. Under questioning, the manager admitted that Rook had repeatedly advised staff to limit contact with Julian because, in his words, family pressure could worsen her condition. Lillian closed her eyes when she heard it. Julian wanted to reach for her hand, but he stopped. This was her moment to endure, not his moment to manage. Dana moved next to the land records. The Voss Agricultural Trust Amendment had been matched to the old notary ledger. The harvest logbook matched newspaper accounts, extension reports, and sworn statements from adults whose families had received winter food from the cave farm. Nora's photographs and tool marks supported evidence of recent sabotage near the water channels. The county maintenance access card fragment connected to a crew that had worked near the cave under a drainage survey paid partly through the church development fund. Then came the financial records. Miles Harlan, the former treasurer, testified by video. He looked ashamed, but steady. He confirmed that Rook had directed payments through the development fund to consultants tied to the Quarry Investment Group. He also confirmed that Rook had warned him not to ask questions because the deal would save Blind Hollow. Rook's face changed for the first time. Not for anger, the kind that appeared when control slipped. By the end of the hearing, the judge denied the emergency conservatorship. Thomas Voss lost his chance before he ever touched a key, account, or signature. The county attorney, who had been observing from the back, requested copies of the evidence. Within 2 days, the proposed quarry transfer was suspended. Within a week, the county board cancelled its vote entirely. The consequences did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like doors closing one after another. Rook was removed from the development committee pending review. The church development fund was placed under independent oversight. A civil settlement required Rook and the fund's former administrators to repay money that had been diverted into unauthorized consulting expenses. The facility lost the Voss contract and was reported to the state licensing board. The county clerk, who had handled several altered land entries, was placed on administrative suspension while the records were reviewed. Rook was not dragged away in handcuffs. Life was not that simple, but he lost the one thing he had built everything on: access. He could no longer approach Lillian. He could no longer speak for the community fund. He could no longer stand before Blind Hollow and pretend his hands were clean. Thomas Voss disappeared from the proceedings after Dana uncovered his consulting agreement with a real estate holding company connected to the quarry proposal. Julian did not call him. Lillian did not either. Some family ties did not break loudly. Some simply stopped being honored. Months passed before the trust was fully stabilized. Dana refiled the Voss Agricultural Trust with an independent board. Lillian served as founding chair in name, but by her own choice, not as a symbol someone else could use. Ruth Calloway joined to protect the historical records. Nora Pike joined to oversee practical repairs. Dana remained legal advisor. Julian funded the first phase of the learning center, but he did not control the board. Lillian made that condition clear. If your money buys the door, she told him one morning, then it becomes another kind of lock. Julian accepted it, not easily, but honestly. Certified engineers repaired the damaged chamber and reinforced the unstable limestone. Parts of the cave stayed closed. No one pretended history made danger disappear. But the first growing beds reopened before winter. The underground garden did not look magical when the valley came back to it. It looked practical, messy, damp, alive. Adults from nearby towns came to learn growing food underground, not as a miracle, but as self-sufficiency. They learned the water channels, the reflected light, the careful soil work, and the discipline Marin Voss had left behind. Her name went on a plaque near the entrance, not as a legend, but as a woman inventor whose work had been buried and then restored. On the first cold morning of the new season, Julian stood with Lillian outside the limestone door. Frost silvered the weeds. Inside, pale lettuce had begun to rise from the dark soil again. Julian held the old key in his hand. For years he had believed protection meant stepping in first, paying first, deciding first. Now he knew better. He turned and placed the key in Lillian's palm. She looked at him for a long time, then she opened the door herself. If this story made you think of something worth protecting, share it in the comments. What would you keep alive, even if everyone else called it worthless?